Hi, my name's Andrew with 555 Gear and welcome to Gear Playtime, episode 2. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the difference between vintage watches and modern watches. In general, the kind of things that you should be aware of, the kind of things that make real differences. So the first major thing you want to be aware of when you're looking at a modern watch versus a vintage watch are just the differences in how the watches are made. In a vintage watch like this Omega Constellation, the crystal is actually acrylic. That's a plastic crystal. Maintenance for that's going to be different than on a modern watch like this Omega Railmaster that has a sapphire crystal. The cases themselves are usually going to be made out of stainless steel. Now, with most modern watches, they're of course quartz, but for watch collectors, you're often going to be looking at a mechanical or a hand-winding movement regardless. And both of these watches happen to be automatics. That being said, even though in general specifications might seem similar between a vintage watch and a modern watch, you are going to want to pay attention to the differences in condition in a significant way, both for the case and for the movement. First of all, with the movement, a lot of times these vintage watches don't have the same power reserve as a modern watch. That is to say, they're not going to generally run as long. In addition to that, in general, they're going to probably need to be serviced if you don't know the service history. For example, this watch does need to be serviced, and I'll explain the story behind it in a little bit. Modern watches do also need to be serviced regularly, and if you're buying a modern watch used, you're probably going to need to get serviced at some point in the relatively soon future. The cost difference between servicing these two movements is going to vary greatly on the kind of movement. This kind of movement, which is a very common Omega bumper movement, that is a very accurate movement and a very reliable movement, is one that is probably going to be able to be serviced by most watchmakers. This Omega Railmaster has a coaxial movement, which is state-of-the-art or very close to state-of-the-art. It's going to require service at an Omega specialist. It's going to be more expensive to service than the Omega Constellation movement. As far as the case goes, you're going to want to look at corrosion in both examples. Of course, with the vintage watches, you're going to be expecting to find maybe rust or dust or other things that are going to need to be cleaned. One thing to look in particular for old cases is signs of repolishing. The idea that this case has been refinished maybe by a jeweler, maybe by a watch dealer when the watch was serviced in the past. Too much refinishing, or in some cases any refinishing at all, is going to be a sign that this watch is probably not going to be as valuable as a collectible to hardcore watch collectors. Modern watches generally shouldn't have any kinds of refinishing. If you're looking for a modern watch, you should just find one in good condition. Most watches are produced in great enough numbers that you shouldn't have to settle for one that's beat up. Or if you're okay with that, you're just going to pay less and assume the possible damage that came along with it being in worse condition. There's also just differences in the story of these watches or the character of these watches. And for me to introduce you to that idea, I'm going to actually introduce you to another place in my kids' playroom, the Lego table. Last thing I wanted to talk about with these watches was something that I thought would be a little bit easier to see right up close, and that is character. This is something that is a little bit more subjective, a little bit more debatable, but I still think it's worth conversing about a little bit. And what I want to talk about with regard to the character of vintage watches versus modern watches is a couple different elements. First of all, there are things that are objectively, in my opinion, character elements. Now that's the story of provenance of a watch and also the state of condition of the watch. Now, provenance is something I've talked about a lot on my channel as the idea of a watch having a lineage or a heritage that gives it a special place in the watch community. Watches like the Rolex Explorer or the Omega Speedmaster Professional, or even like, for example, the Omega Railmaster. You could say the same for the Constellation too, since it has a very important place in Omega's history. So one thing you're going to want to consider is just what's the general story about this watch. The more specific thing you might want to consider is what's the story of this individual watch. So for example, I received this Omega Constellation as a gift from a dear old friend, completely unexpected and gratuitous, and it's just a watch that he has enjoyed for a long time but was ready to pass on. Incredible gift, really an incredible gift from someone that I really respect, and it was just a pleasure and a great surprise to be able to receive this from him. So the individual story of this watch is much more important to me than the example of this watch, the Railmaster, which was purchased from a reliable fellow collector on a forum, but there's no personal element to me acquiring this watch at all. So that personal story is definitely something to consider. Now, if you've acquired a vintage watch from family, don't discount the importance of that story, even if it needs a lot of attention, because in the long run, that's going to matter more, in my opinion. Second thing to talk about is patina, or the actual condition of the watch. And patina is one of those things that there's all kinds of different opinions about the merits and demerits of patina. Basically, it's just the character of the watch based on the condition of the watch. So for example, this Omega dial, you can see has beautifully aged, a nice kind of mellow copper brown, and has lots of spots on it. This was originally more of a silver dial, and that character is just something that personally I think is fantastic because it's very unique. The Railmaster has character from the design of the watch because it's a heritage watch, but there isn't any kind of patina, and honestly I don't expect this watch to patina in very many ways, since the kind of lume that's used on the dial isn't going to age. This is a black matte dial that perhaps will become a little more tropical or light brown over time. But aside from that, there really isn't a lot of ways that this watch is going to develop character through patina over time. There are some modern watches that I expect will do that. Panerai guys love patina, for example. Some watches like the Omega Speedmaster Professional, which are so similar to vintage watches, will probably also acquire a lot of character over time. But really, the thing is about character, as far as the condition of the watch goes, the thing that's going to really appeal to most people is whether or not the character that the watch has in scratch and dents, in discolorations, in changes, is from your actual ownership experience with the watch. If it's something that is a result of your adventures, that's going to be more special to you. So to wrap things up, the three things I would consider with vintage watches versus modern watches in general would be the specification differences, the differences in condition and the potential need for a watch to be serviced, and then lastly I would consider the story, something that is going to speak to you personally as a collector over time. Both this Omega Constellation and this Omega Railmaster are amazing watches. They're both beautiful, high quality watches, and you can't go wrong either way as long as you shop smart and get a watch that is in original condition as much as possible. One last tip with vintage watches in particular, you want to be careful to avoid fakes, especially on a place like eBay. Always buy the seller. Okay, thanks a lot for watching. I really enjoyed this. I hope you did, and make sure to give me a like and a subscription if you haven't already. Thanks a lot.